Kia ora, everyone. My name is Joseph Bobulia, and I'm a professor of psychology at Victoria University in Wellington. And I'm going to be covering the topic of the evolutionary psychology of religion. If you have any questions about this lecture or about the readings, you can get in touch with me at the email address on this opening slide. It'll be really important for you to do the readings. Both the readings and the lecture are mutually important for one another. Okay, without further ado, I'm going to describe some key concepts that you're going to need to understand the theories and evidence that we describe in the evolutionary psychology of religion over the weeks ahead. Now, the first concept that I want you to remember is this idea that evolution works by natural selection. Now, natural selection is a very simple, blind process that can exist wherever we have three conditions that are satisfied. There is a population, the first condition, and that population is variable. Secondly, there's some competition within that population so that not every variant within it can survive. And there's a principle of inheritance such that the offspring within a population tend to resemble the parents. Now, when we have these three conditions in place, evolution can accumulate design over periods of time. So that's the first key concept. Now, in your own time, I'd encourage you to look at this link on bacterial evolution from University of Harvard, where you can see they've set up an experiment where bacteria can evolve in real time, and you can view this happening. So I think that no one doubts that evolutionary processes can give rise to design where you have variation, some kind of competition, and some principle of inheritance. Now, the second thing I want you to keep in mind is that evolution by natural selection is not the only process that gives rise to variation at the population level. There can be a key process in evolution is simply migration. So you get a species moving from one area to another, and there's separation in that species. And over time, you get some drifting and separation, distinction between the populations. In the first instance here, I put the note mutation. For selection to occur, there needs to be some sort of mutation that occurs within a population. So if a mutation never happens, there can't be a process of evolution by natural selection. There's drift. Populations accumulate changes over time just because of random assorting. So selection is only one of the processes that gives rise to change at the population level, but it's the key process by which design accumulates within species over time. The third point to keep in mind is that when we think of the stuff that continues within a population over time, the genes, those are giving rise to organisms, the animals or the creatures, through engagements with the environment. Organisms need nourishment. They arise like a bit like a cake arises from a recipe through the recipe and the ingredients, right? The ingredients make the cake. Genotypes gives rise to phenotypes. We call the organism, the body of the organism, the phenotype, is through that interaction. And like a recipe, which can work out well or work out not so well, there is inherent variability within those processes. Moreover, the genotypes can be designed to change in response to environments in different ways. So I want to underscore four different types of response to an environment, or biologists call these norms of reaction, that can describe how it is that a feature in an organism is expressed. The first type of norm of reaction I want to describe is called biological determinism. So, in a biologically determined genotype, where there are differences between the genotypes, these will lead to differences, these will lead to constant phenotypes, irrespective of the environment. Okay, so you are biologically determined to have 5-finger hand. Now, something might go wrong in the process of development where you have 4 fingers, but across the population, genotypes are pretty fixed in this expression. And the no amount of education or nourishment will lead you to have 6 fingers. That's an example of biological determinism. Social determinism would be a genotype expresses a phenotype, or different genotypes express the same phenotype in response to environmental influences. So, for example, you might have a very different language capacity than mine, but because we were both surrounded by English speakers at some point, you are expressing a socially determined English variant of your language. Okay. So the context was causing the expression of that trait, your language dialect. Now, of course, you wouldn't have language at all if you didn't have a specific type of genotype. Your dog's genotype will not lead to language no matter how much you speak it. But if you have variation in the human genotype, you're going to get that socially determined expression. There are, thirdly, additive interactions. We can think of athletes who have a genetic endowment of some kind, which leads them to be Olympic sprinters, say. Well, no amount of training that I undertake will enable me to be an Olympic sprinter. Nevertheless, both the Olympic sprinters and I, if we embark on a process of training, will improve in our speed. So that would be called an additive interaction, where genotypes vary, but they vary in the same way in response to an environment. A non-additive interaction would be the variation in genotype in opposite directions in response to an environmental influence. An example of this is also comes from sport. It turns out that some people, the more that they train, the more weight they lose. I think that's typical for most people. However, some people, the more they train, the more weight that they put on. It has to do with their body type. Include this slide because I want to avoid the platitudes that many people have about biological determinism. Well, there is biological determinism. That's one type of norm of reaction. Social determinism is another, but there's a broad space of possibility within evolution for genotypes to express phenotypes differently. Now, it's going to be really important for us to keep in mind that selection doesn't just operate on genes. Richard Dawkins, famous proponent of the idea that ideas can undergo selection-like processes because there is a population of differing ideas, so there's variation. There are constraints on the number of ideas that can exist within people's brains, so there's competition for ideas. And there's a principle of inheritance that we can transmit thoughts to each other with relatively high fidelity. The fidelity isn't perfect. We tell, I don't know, Chinese whispers lead to different stories over time, but there's some retention of the information. If this wasn't true, there'd be no point in lecturing because you wouldn't get the ideas that I want you to get. So selection isn't just limited to genes. We can see selection. We do see selection operating at the level of cultures. We're going to come back to that next week. Okay, the fifth point that I want you to keep in mind is the idea that in humans, we have evolved to offload a large part of the adaptive response we have onto the environment. So we don't have to grow bodies that protect us from harsh environments. We can build buildings that do this, and we can make clothing. We don't need to learn everything individually. We can retain knowledge in places like libraries. Not all of us needs to be a specialist in everything. We have divisions of all kinds of labor. And that kind of possibility in humans gives rise to a very distinctive dynamic within evolution. We are not just creatures that are evolving in response to external environments. We are modifying our environments in order to affect the selective pressures on us. But this type of modification is sometimes referred to as niche construction. And in the context of religion, it's very important to keep in mind that quite a lot of the explanation for how people think religiously and how they behave will be, at least in part and perhaps in large part, explained through the ways in which humans have offloaded religious culture onto their environments. So again, we're not going to have a really simplistic idea of the evolutionary psychology of religion. We need to have a concept that includes within it this recognition that how humans are adapted psychologically and behaviorally is in large part, or at least in some part, it's an open question how large, a function of what humans have offloaded onto their environments. So this added dimension of niche construction will be really important to keep in mind as we progress in the evolutionary psychology of religion. So the sixth point I would like you to keep in mind is that there's a distinction between ultimate and proximate causation. So the ultimate explanation for a trait is going to be different from the proximate or the evolutionary explanation, like how did the trait enables reproduction survival, how it is that it has become part of a repertoire of traits within a population. That kind of ultimate explanation is going to be different from the proximate causes, how a particular trait works. A simple example from biology, sickleback fish attack other male sicklebacks that invade their territory. Now, the proximate cue for the attack is a red belly. Male sicklebacks have red bellies, and so when they see a fish with a red belly, they just go for it and attack the thing. That's the kind of proximate mechanism, red attack. The whole behavioral repertoire evolved because by chasing away other male sicklebacks, a male decreases its chances for being cuckolded by another male. And so that's the reason that you see this behavioral feature within this lineage. Okay, so we'll want to keep that in mind because many features of religious thought and behavior look on the face of it to be utterly confusing from a vantage point of selection. They don't look adapted at all. They look maladaptive. We'll get into that in some detail this week. So for example, celibacy, it looks to be extremely maladaptive. It's not a good way of getting your genes into the next population. Spending a lot of time and resource investing in supernatural activities, some of which are extremely risky, can be a bad looks to be a bad use of time. But the proximate mechanisms, which look to be costly or ineffective or wasteful or dangerous might have ultimate explanations. And I think that's a really key kind of point that we're going to be focusing on, particularly in this week's lecture when we talk about costly rituals, that they can do something for us because ultimately those costs are functional. Okay, the seventh point I want you to keep in mind is that evolutionary psychology is really based on the principle of reverse engineering. So many of us, when we're interested in psychology, we're interested in the proximal mechanism. So how is it that vision is produced? How does attention work? Why do we need to think about the distant human past in order to understand those mechanisms? Well, sometimes we don't. In fact, very frequently we don't. We just can understand the proximate system without thinking about its ultimate causes. Nevertheless, evolutionary psychology is based on the idea that once we understand the functions of a system by having that ultimate explanation in mind, we can better understand the otherwise perplexing features of that system. We can unlock the design components of that system better. We can be better proximate explainers when we have the ultimate reasons in mind. A good example of this is this tool that you see in front of you. Some of you might know what the tool does. Many of you perhaps don't. I want you to take a moment to think about what it could be. Looks to me like it could be maybe a torture device of some kind, or someone told me that they thought it was a tool for cutting eggs, which sounds plausible. But once we know the function of the design, we really get an understanding of why it is that it is elaborated in the way before us. So, for example, if it's an egg cutter, what does this thing do? Is that just extraneous, a kind of artistic flourish or something like that? Well, the answer is that it's an avocado cutter. The radius of the tool is too large for eggs, and that little piece at the top that I showed before, that's useful or can be useful for extracting the pit of the avocado. So once you know the function of the tool, its design features become apparent, and we can get a better insight into how that proximate system works once we have the functions in mind. Well, that's the theory, and we're going to look at applications of ultimate explanation, biological function, to make sense of proximate religious thinking and behaving in the week ahead. The eighth point I want you to keep in mind is that in psychology, we operationalize our terms. So many people, what is religion? Is, I don't know, is sport a kind of religion? Is Netflix a kind of religion? There aren't any definitions in the back of the book of life that can tell us whether one thing is religion or not. It's up to us to specify the meanings of our words. In this course, we're going to be thinking about religion as beliefs and behaviors. So commitments, thinking something is real, and then responding behaviorally to objects or targets that are supernatural or supernormal. It turns out that the concept of the supernatural, it looks to be universally understood. So if I say the ghost of someone who has departed, people in every culture recognize that kind of target, a ghost, as being different from natural things. A ghost can move through walls. A ghost can hear what you're saying, even when no one appears to be present. A ghost can be immortal, that kind of thing. So when you describe these concepts to people in different cultures, they recognize that as being supernatural. Now, one thing about religion is that it is absolutely ubiquitous. It's as old as humans are, and we find beliefs and behaviors regarding the supernatural everywhere. So a key question is, why do people have those beliefs? Now, there might be a supernatural of some kind out there, and I think many of the people working in this area, I won't tell you my own views, but do have those beliefs, and nothing about the science can tell us for sure what's out there. That's really important. But in science, we begin with the assumption that there is the natural world, and we try to make sense of behavior in light of the natural world. Even if you have your particular beliefs, which many of you will, you might be puzzled by how it is that the Greeks, for example, could believe in the Greek pantheon. You probably don't believe in the Greek pantheon, so it can become a puzzle to explain the beliefs and behaviors respecting supernatural beings in other people. Now, as I mentioned, the evidence for beliefs and rituals respecting the supernatural is ancient. And it's very hard for us to get a concept of how old humans are. I think when I was going to grad school, there was an area called, antiquity studies, and it went from the early Greek and Roman period to 400 AD, I think it was. And that was like the ancient world. So I've just drafted a little timeline, and I want you to kind of imagine yourself walking along that timeline, where the arrow at the farthest point on the left, it represents now. And if you take one step, that's, let's say, 2,000 years. Well, you take one step and that gets us back to Christianity, but we have to take 15 steps more of those 2,000-year chunks to get back to the cave drawings in Klotz and Chauvet. So it's an enormous expanse of time before we get to the art, which depicts both natural and supernatural beings. If you're interested in a good movie pick, you can check out Werner Herzog's Cave of Dreams, which talks about Chauvet, where you see quasi-human, quasi-animal forms intermingling, depicted on the walls, preserved in the walls of this cave, or really cave network. And that's an extraordinary period of time that people have been doing this. Well, we have to double that period of time before we get to the purposeful symbolic ochre etchings of Blombos in South Africa, which again depicts abstract thought. Now, archaeologists read into the beliefs and that are expressed in these behaviors, but we know that modern anatomical humans are twice that old, and it's a simple hypothesis to imagine that they were engraving symbolic objects because they had some beliefs respecting them. We see the Kafes, which are Neanderthal burials in Israel, that are another 30,000 years older than the earliest datings of the Blombos abstractions. So that's, again, another 15 steps in that 2,000-year stride that you're taking to get back to that period. Well, we have to double that. So we have to take 75 steps in total to get to the Herto archaeology in Midwash, Ethiopia, which Tim White and his group at I think it was the University of California, Berkeley, uncovered, where they found ritualized uses of skulls within the old matrix of sand and silt. They uncovered this, and they could find that there were these skulls that were engraved, and the skulls were not scavenged. The etchings and markings on them, they looked to the archaeologists to be evidence that they were swinging the skulls in some way around their heads, which would be consistent with a ritualistic purpose. So the point here is to say that rituals and beliefs respecting the supernatural, the supernormal, look to be as old as we are. Now, that's interesting because evolution is a process of weeding out inefficient and ineffective traits within a population over time. So we wouldn't expect anything to be conserved for that long unless it had some sort of function. But what could the functions be? That's the plot that's thickening here. And we talked about the antiquity of religions. A colleague of mine, when I was at the University of Auckland, and I created a global map of all the churches in the world. And we can see that in this map, this is a partial map. So these are all the churches that have been listed on OpenStreetMaps. So we might have, in some countries, we have many more than are presented on the map. Nevertheless, even by underestimating the number of churches, we find well over 28,000 churches in New Zealand. So there are more churches and places of worship than there are schools that are listed in OpenStreetMaps. So this an extraordinary prominence of religion, even within what many regard to be a highly secular culture of New Zealand. We can see when we zoom in on the map of the Hutt Valley that the contours of the valley are represented by the alignment of churches. If you didn't have any streets to go by, you could recover the contour of the Hutt Valley just by plotting the churches that are still there. This is a small square in Petone, and we can see even in an area that is less than 1 square kilometer that there are 8 churches and only 2 schools. So there continues to be an incredibly powerful influence of religion within our own society. This is a map of the Wellington region. So religion isn't just old and ancient and highly conserved, it's around us everywhere. Now, when I talk about biology and evolution and evolutionary psychology, well, we're really thinking about traits that are, we think of evolution as giving rise to adaptations that are very commonplace within a population. Beliefs and rituals respecting the supernatural are commonplace. But the content of those beliefs and the form of those rituals is extraordinarily variable. So it can range from the top right-hand corner here, we depict the Aztec sacrificial rituals, which were fundamental to the construction of the Aztec Empire, and an incredibly effective and efficient with a reach that extended across the Yucatan Peninsula, incorporating at least 400 smaller villages. So it's incredibly impressive political coordinating system. And at the center, there was blood rituals, sacrifices of humans to the gods. These humans were often warriors who were opposing the empire, but they often weren't. They could be ordinary citizens were just selected randomly for sacrifice at the great altars at the center of the empire. Well, that's one form in which religious belief or supernatural belief and behavior has taken. At the opposite end, in the upper left-hand corner, we see the rituals of the Kalahari Kung, which are healing rituals, which are basically all-night parties where people stay up and dance and enter trance-like states to engage with ancestors and try to make people better. In Kung belief systems, it's the ancestors that make us sick because they want to bring people back to live with them. So we have this extraordinary range. We have in the middle here some California cosmetic Buddhism, which is associated with the beauty industry. At the bottom right, we have the extraordinary regimented political system of the Roman Catholic Vatican, which at one point controlled the empires of Europe, right? It was a kind of super empire that was sitting over the political authority in Europe. So we have to kind of reconcile that variation with the variation of other traditions. At the very bottom is a piercing ritual that a colleague at Victoria, Ron Fisher, and I observed when we were in Mauritius doing ritual field work. And that man is having a large, almost the size of a spear kind of going through his cheeks as part of religious piety. So we have that kind of piety and healing and staying up all night and cosmetic engagement with yourself, kind of New Age Buddhism, all part of that enormous scope of human cultural diversity. So we're going to want to try to understand whether evolutionary principles can help to explain this broad pattern of variation in culture. That's a lot, but by having the ultimate explanation to hand, perhaps we can make some at least preliminary insight or preliminary progress in understanding impressive variation of human religious belief and behavior. Okay, so those are the kind of 10 things to keep in mind. You might need to review them or write them down, but it will be important for you to have those, your awareness as we enter into understanding the psychology, evolutionary psychology of religion. This week, we're going to focus on what are called commitment signaling models of religion. Now, to understand a commitment signaling model for religion, we have to understand the inadequacy of what has been, I guess, the traditional view, functional view of religion, that it makes people cooperative. Okay, so from the traditional view, we have this idea that, well, in the first instance, people have imaginative theories of mind, right? We don't just attempt to understand the beliefs and intentions and strategies of others within our own social milieu. We tend to extrapolate and project the personalities of others into the world. Okay, so and it's almost like an automated tendency for people to perceive human-like otherness in the natural world. Many of you will have laid on your back as a kid and looked up at the sky and perceived faces within the clouds. So an old theory of religion, this one goes back to Critias, who's 4th century BC, has long been argued that religious belief evolves to police people. So Critias had said that even if you plan and silence some evil deed, it will not be hidden from the gods, right? So the gods are moral police forces. And that would make sense if the function of religion was to keep people in line, because where humans cooperate and tend to act in the interest of a collective, that collective will go farther. And in going farther, it will benefit the individuals. You can think of paying your taxes as an example of how it is that cooperation can work. By paying our taxes, we get all sorts of nice things like roads and universities and hospitals. But if one of us doesn't pay the taxes, we still get all sorts of nice things. However, if no one pays taxes, those nice things are inaccessible. So if there were a mechanism that would police people into acting for the benefit of a collective, well, that policing system would tend to be evolvable. And people have argued for that about religion. Well, there are some problems with this view, and that's going to bring us up to the point of commitment signaling. The first problem is that, well, how do we get just from perceiving things to beliefs in gods? Like, that seems to be a really large evolutionary leap. It's particularly large if the gods themselves don't actually police behaviors. So we'll use the example of Zeus. Zeus, we'll just suppose, doesn't exist. So if the belief in Zeus evolved to make people cooperative, well, then those people who were, if there was any variation in the population where people tended to be suspicious, well, those people who were not policing in response to those beliefs, well, they wouldn't be actually punished. So think of, I don't know, the tax problem again. So if you don't believe that Zeus is going to punish you for not paying your taxes, well, then you won't. And others like you who don't, in a system where lots of people are paying their taxes, well, those defectors will tend to do better. And as a result, the defectors will have more offspring, and you won't get this kind of conservation of that trait for belief. So in order for there to be a conservation of the trait, there needs to be something more than belief. A third problem is that there's temporal discounting. There There are many things that we believe that are bad for us, drinking to excess or smoking or vaping, I guess is the thing we do now. But hey, you're young and there's lots of time between now and when these unhealthy activities will catch up with us. And so we can, I guess the shadow of the future, the very distant future, our deaths might not be all that motivating when it comes to defecting in the here and now. So how do you get these beliefs going? Well, in this week's lecture, we're going to look at how the puzzle of belief is solved by a puzzle of rituals. So the thing about rituals that we've noted is that they're extremely costly. Well, there's the material costs, the resources that are involved in producing religion. There's the opportunity costs, the things you could be doing other than partaking of these activities. Metabolic costs, staying up all night and dancing consumes energy. More energy needs to come into a system, a biological system, than goes out. So animals tend to conserve. There's the risks to health, which we just mentioned. Well, the idea that we're going to consider this week is that, in a nutshell, actions speak louder than words. So it's very commonplace across lineages to observe what look to be extremely costly behaviors. These costly behaviors can evolve in a setting where the production of the behavior communicates to an audience a fact about the creature that would be hard to fake. The action is verifying some property of the creature. So here we can see the springbok gazelle. A springbok gazelle leap up and down in the presence of a predator. And that's a puzzling behavior because the predator is, it's not just a nasty thing, it's a lethal thing. A predator will kill the springbok gazelle. When lions are in the presence of these gazelle, they leap up and down. And the effect of this leaping is to cause the lions to be uninterested in a chase. Well, why is that? Why would a creature be exhausting itself before a potential life and death chase? Well, that's because neither the lion nor the springbok gazelle wants the chase to happen. So the gazelle's leaping up and down is a way of saying, hey, I'm really fit. You're never going to catch me. No point in chasing me. And so that cost and the behavior, or that feature of the behavior, is arrayed in a way that's identifying a trait of fitness in the gazelle, which evolves as part of a communication system. There's a whole book describing these kinds of behaviors. It's called The Handicap Principle. I was actually reading this book that I began to think about how rituals might be costly means for verifying supernatural beliefs that are making us cooperative. It turns out that emotional expressions are very hard to fake. And across, again, many animal lineages and certainly humans, there are a range of emotional expressions that have evolved to identify our affective states. It turns out to be quite difficult to conceal fear when you feel it. It's the production of a natural smile. It's called a Duchenne smile. Is very difficult in the absence of positive feeling. It's because the articulation of the muscles that are involved in a natural smile are produced, or that sequence of activation isn't generated from parts of our cortex that are explicitly under our control. They're activated through the limbic and motor systems of cortex, and that's why we get these smiles. You can trick yourself into smiling without amusement, but it takes a bit of practice. We're going to be looking at religious beliefs and behaviors through this lens of the ultimate causes of evolution. And we're going to try to understand whether we can get some explanation for conservation of moralizing beliefs in the supernatural and the conservation of ritualistic behaviors through a common set of ultimate functions. Okay. Well, that's probably a lot for you to try to wrap your head around right now. It's okay to be confused. Engage with the readings, come back to the lecture. And if you have any questions, you can get in touch with me and I'll be happy to answer them for you. So I'll leave you with that for now. Thanks for your attention.